this chapter is kind of an interesting one because it's lumping together a couple different developments and movements. You notice it talks about liberalism in religion. And we've talked about quite a few liberal denominations with respect to Christianity and even with respect to Judaism. But now it's talking about liberal religion in America as such, and it's going to bring in a few other players into this. The radicalism part, really, I don't know why you put that in the chapter because it doesn't fit the theme that well. You might say how America became a primarily secular nation. That's what this chapter is really about. So it's kind of doing two things. It's telling you about these very liberal groups, organizations, movements, and then it's also talking about why it is that, say, for example, most Americans actually don't know that much about religion, whereas if it were 40 years ago, they probably would know more about at least some varieties of American religion. So it starts off by talking about utilitarianism. Not utilitarianism, Unitarianism, sorry. Utilitarianism is an ethics theory that we go over. Unitarianism is a religious movement that comes out of the Congregationalists, and we've already charted out that group at a couple different points. And it notes that in the 19th century, it's the firmest institutional base for liberal religion was Unitarianism. And remember, what were the Unitarians known for? Well, rejecting the Trinity, focusing on the individual and their own progress and their self-development, saying that you don't need any sort of creeds or things like that. They also tended to be pretty elite, When they merged with the Universalists, they sort of brought in some of the more middle-class people. But it says that they found their leadership challenged from a number of different directions. And these different directions are what we want to look at in this chapter. So one thing is agnosticism. We're going to hit on that. Agnosticism was something fairly new on the scene. It had been around, but it hadn't been named for a long time. A lot of the ideas that Unitarians had developed were being adopted by other Christian denominations under the generic name of liberal Protestantism or modernism, like the benevolence of God, the potential of human happiness, the compatibility of religious faith with contemporary science and philosophy. There was a humanist movement, and we'll talk about what humanism means in a minute. And then the Depression came along, and the Depression affected everybody's ability to get things done for organizations. So, although they were upper class, they found themselves kind of shrinking a bit in what they were able to do. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, you see kind of a revival of Unitarianism. And your book talks about why that was the case. They reorganized themselves administratively. They actually ended up merging with the Universalists. They sort of renewed their commitment to inclusiveness, got involved in, for example, the civil rights struggle, reasserted traditional social concerns. They started experimenting with new forms of local structure. And one of the experiments that they did is what your book talks about as the lay fellowship plan. So Unitarians were, until that time, largely concentrated in New England, particularly in Massachusetts, particularly around Boston. And actually, it's still the case that this area has a lot more Unitarians, say, than Colorado does, or Wisconsin. What they did, though, is they took out newspaper ads, and they suggested that people organize small informal group meetings, not in churches, but in people's houses or in rented structures, and that they would get together and think about religion, have a dialogue, do things like reading texts, playing music, hearing people give testimonies, And this led to Unitarianism spreading, because some of these local groups eventually turned into congregations. Some of them remained, sort of low level. They emerged in 1961 with the Universalist Church, forming this new denomination. And your book talks about some of the social issues that they've been involved in. So when we talk about liberalism, we're usually thinking about people that are progressives, people that are trying to change society towards their vision of something that's more inclusive, more fair, breaking down social barriers. Your book talks about a number of important feminist leaders, Susan B. Anthony, who you might know from those old dollars that used to circulate around, the coins. Well worth reading, though. She was a Unitarian. Quite a few Unitarians were involved in the civil rights movement. And then one of the things that we saw in the 1970s and 80s was a lot of the forces that had been sort of set in motion by the civil rights movement, which had to do mainly with African Americans in the South, and then with African Americans in the northern cities. And then the feminist movement was other liberation movements came about, and Unitarians were involved in those, championing gay rights, for example, already in the 1980s. Your book talks about them as being a small denomination, and that is quite true. They don't plan to expand. They don't plan to try to take up a much greater, as we call it, market share of the religious marketplace. Instead, they view themselves as sort of an elite that are evangelists not for their group itself, but rather for the causes it espouses. Demographically, one of the really interesting features of the Universalists, like your book points out, is about 80% of the membership came to the association through affiliation rather than birth. So what does that actually mean? If their numbers are staying more or less constant, and about 20% of them were born into it. Like a lot of people are born into their parents' religion. Most Catholics are not converts. They were baptized as infants as Catholics. Same thing you could probably say for most Baptists, for most Presbyterians. Their parents kind of dictated that. And some of them, go off the proverbial reservation and say, I'm doing something different. But a lot of religions are associated with these long-standing communities. Yeah.
I have just a weird question that popped into my head. But
sure.
Would the Amish be considered something like that, or are they more of just a society? Are they religious? They
don't make a lot of converts. That's for sure. Yeah. I mean, most people who are Amish, it's because their parents were Amish, their grandparents were Amish. They had that time when they got to choose whether to reaffirm that, to integrate that into their lives. But the ones that did, there's not a lot of evangelists out there saying, hey, let's make everybody Amish.
Yeah.
With the Unitarians, 80% of them started out as not being Unitarians. So it's largely a church of converts. Their numbers are staying the same, so what else does that tell you? Yeah?
They're not losing people.
Well, they are losing people, but they're getting other people back in return. It's kind of a revolving door church or religious organization. Each generation, if you join and then, most of the people in the organization, once you're having kids, are not in there because their parents were, but because they were attracted to it for one reason or another, that means that a lot of the kids are actually leaving. Otherwise, they'd be growing, right? They'd be growing by leaps and bounds. So that's something important to keep in mind. Where do they go to? A lot of them sort of spin off into other liberal denominations. Then your book starts talking about some American history, and they go back to the Revolutionary era. We've talked now about Unitarians. Go a little bit further back, and we've mentioned them before. You have the Deists, and Deists were Also, Unitarian in the sense that they didn't believe in a Trinity. They believed in God being a creator who sort of sets up the world. They thought that Jesus was a nice guy, but not God incarnate. And they thought that you could figure out what God's plan was by looking at the natural law, which was revealed through science and through morality. So, some important examples of this were Thomas Jefferson, but also Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote a book called The Age of Reason, which is quite interesting. He wrote it during the French Revolution. Who was the French Revolution against? What do you remember from your history classes? Yeah.
Isn't like Louis or something like that?
Well, you got way more Louis than that. Louis the 16th,
Oh, Louis.
right? But you're right. It wasn't Louis, but not just the king, because they killed him, but they killed a lot more other people. Who was the revolution targeting? Who are they saying had been screwing everybody else over, the common people, for centuries? The king and the queen. Anyone else remember? Yeah.
The aristocrats?
Yeah, the aristocracy, the nobility. They got rid of pretty much any one of those that they could get their hands on. Some of them got out of the country and survived, but many of them found their way to the executioner. The guillotine was designed to make executions quicker and more humane, and it was put to great effect during the French Revolution. Who else was it against? Yeah.
The church.
Yeah, the Catholic Church. Religious orders were, in effect, closed and kicked out of France overnight, and many priests and nuns and monks were told, you're no longer a religious, and we might just kill you. Now, bless you, the French Revolution had switched, away from Catholicism being the official state religion to a lot of endorsement of atheism. Thomas Paine was very worried about that. He thought that if you go all the way to atheism, then there won't be any morals and everybody will just do whatever they want. He thought that deism was going to be a substitute for that. So he wrote this book, The Age of Reason, which is an argument for deism. Now, after the Civil War, these were people who were engaging in attacks on traditional religion. After the Civil War, like it says, attacks on traditional religion played a small but important role in the public realm of debate. Somebody they mentioned you probably read, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, was his real name, but Mark Twain. Probably you haven't read books of his that directly attack or satirize religion, like Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn. There's some things about the preachers and that, but he wrote other books where he's very explicitly targeting the religion of his time. And then something else starts to come on the scene. Agnosticism. And when we use that word agnostic, how are agnostics different from atheists? Yeah.
Just from what I always thought it was like you're not really concerned with whether or not there is a God. You're not out to prove that there isn't or to find it. You're just kind of, whatever.
So you got theism on the one hand, belief in God or gods, and then you have atheism on the other hand, and then agnosticism would be kind of a middle.
Yeah, that's what I always thought it was.
Yeah, and it could be from a variety of different standpoints. It could be saying, well, look, we just can't know. Maybe the atheists are right, maybe the theists are right. Who knows? Could be, I don't really care. It's not relevant to me. It doesn't play any important role in my life. That was not something that was a very common stance, say, during the Reformation or during the, America before the Civil War. There were actually a lot of people for whom religion didn't have a lot of relevance, particularly in unchurched areas. But as time went on, more and more people got drawn into religious organizations. So this guy Huxley, he coins this term agnosticism. And like your book points out, it enters the American vocabulary. And people would call themselves agnostics when they thought that it's just not relevant to my life, or I just can't possibly know. And along with agnosticism tended to go the view that really a lot of these questions aren't to be handled by religion, they're to be handled by, say, philosophy or science or something else, maybe history. So a lot of the big questions that religion had been answering for a lot of people were getting displaced to other disciplines. Your book also talks about Mencken. If you've never read H.L. Mencken, I strongly suggest that you read at least some of his stuff. He's an extremely funny guy. If you're religious, you probably will be offended in reading Mencken, because he also had a lot of bile for religion. He covered the Scopes monkey trial and really just pilloried the conservatives there. A few other things that were going on. As society grew more pluralistic, that means as more and more viewpoints were being represented, court decisions begin to constrict the expression of religious themes in public arenas. Why? Well, because, if you... Well, let's think about, some contemporary examples. What are the problems that people usually have with Ten Commandment displays in, say, courthouses? There's a big thing going on right now because I forget exactly what courthouse it is, but it's got a bunch of different religious statuary, you'd call it, and the Satanists now have a statue that they've been building and are going to put in there. It's like circulating around on the internet. How do we get to that point? Or what would be wrong, for example, with having, like, in the town square, having a Christmas display, not just like Santa Claus and candy canes or Christmas trees, but Jesus and Joseph and Mary and the wise men and that sort of thing, and a nativity scene. Why do people get leery about that? Does it bother any of you if they do that sort of thing? It's fine. It's their electric bill. Let them do what they want.
Well, particularly the recent case that came out to report town priests and prayers. A lot of people feel as if the government is condoning certain religions and encouraging that religion, and those who are not included feel like the town's not going to take them serious.
Yeah, that's exactly it. If you're not represented, then it feels like, hey, what about me? Don't I count? Am I a second-class citizen? How are these other people looking at me too? If I don't, fit in with what they're doing, if I don't endorse it. So the Supreme Court engaged in a lot of cases like this, going all the way back to the 1940s in some cases, but it really picked up speed in the 60s and 70s. Now this ended up producing a backlash, with attacks against secular humanism. I remember when I was a kid, so we're talking about the 80s, people were very, very worried about secular humanism and how it was going to destroy the youth, and we had books that we had to read about it. Turned out there weren't that many secular humanists out there, not as many as we thought. So this is a good point to talk about humanism. Humanism, by the way, is a term that doesn't necessarily mean secular humanism. There were great humanists in the Renaissance. There's a whole bunch of people that we just call the humanists, like Erasmus. He was a correspondent of Martin Luther. A lot of what they did was sort of try to recover ancient Greek and Latin philosophy, to some degree theology, history, literature, and to talk about the human condition. They wanted to focus on what makes us human. What is our experience? What is central to us? How can we live better lives? And some of them were religious and some of them were not religious. Some of them were actually, when it comes down to it, atheists. In recent times, when people start calling themselves humanists, quite often there is an anti-religious or at least non-religious, sort of aspect to it. Although there are important Christian, Jewish, humanists in the 20th century. But at least the people who are signing these manifestos, like the first Humanist Manifesto and the second, much more starkly oppositional Humanist Manifesto, let alone the secular Humanist Manifesto, they are seeing it as a sort of taking religion and taking all the religiosity out of it, trying to capture what religion would give us without actually being committed to any particular religion. Your book points out a number of different organizations that tend to be allied with humanism. One of the ones that they talk about is ethical culture. Not very big. Big in this area, though. Founded by Felix Adler, a Reformed rabbi. It stresses human moral responsibility and potential, and it provides sort of an organized forum for discussion and education for families who aren't comfortable with traditional religion. But other groups that they mention would be like the ACLU. You know, they often bring cases to the Supreme Court. They bring briefs. People for the American Way, which was founded by Norman Lear to try to counteract the moral majority, which again was a big thing in the 1980s, kind of waned in the 1990s. Some Jewish organizations that are you know, they don't like the notion that America would be a Christian nation, which is a very, you know, tough sell these days. There's a few organizations of atheists. You know where you actually see a lot of ferment in discussions about atheism is not so much in organizations that actually bring people together face to face. Where do you see a lot of this stuff? Instead, what would be the alternative? Just type in atheist into a Google search. And there'll be some organizations that come up, and there'll be some events that come up, you know, atheists getting together. Important people like Richard Dawkins will come up, but what else will come up? Or type in atheist versus Christian, or atheist versus creationist, or something like that. You get a lot of YouTube videos.
Yeah, you see lots of debate between scientists and those who don't believe some science theories.
Yeah, and not necessarily scientists and those who don't believe scientific theories, because some of the ones on the side aren't actually scientists, they're sort of evangelists of science. But they have the view that science can answer everything. And then, you know, some of their opposition, they try to sort of formulate what they're doing as kind of a science, but pretty unsuccessfully. But atheism as such, you can find a ton of discussions of it on the internet. There's like an entire sphere, you know. There's people, I hesitate to bring up any one of them because it sounds like I'm endorsing them as opposed to other ones, but there's some people who have, you know, millions of YouTube followers who do videos about atheism. Some of them kind of angry, some of them a bit more rational. So let's move on a bit. Another thing that the book talks about, here's one of the sort of dilemmas that you have to face in thinking about this from any sort of religious studies perspective. Is there really a kind of, you know, concerted effort to push religion out of American life, to marginalize it, to change the, you know, we've seen that America has been a very religious nation for much of its history. Is there some sort of, you know, massive concerted effort to do so? Or is this more a product of, you know, social changes, cultural changes that we can look at where you can't say, those people are in charge and they're the ones who are doing it? Your book, and I think correctly, takes the position that it's more the second one. And they talk about the difference between secularism and secularity. Secularity is the state of, you know, religion not mattering to the degree that it used to, where religion becomes privatized, where religion becomes, in many respects, pushed to the margins. Americans, you know, unfortunately, because of that, suffer from a high degree of religious illiteracy, not knowing very important things about religion. Because it's possible to know all about religions without actually endorsing them or participating in them or appreciating them. And if you don't know much about religion, it's very hard to know much about history or about a lot of literature or why the world is the way it is, because religion has been such an important force in history. But there's a lot of people for whom religion just doesn't have much relevance. Your book talks about this category of the nuns. Not nuns like wearing habits. Nuns as in, when you're asked to list your religious affiliation, they put none. Because they never had any religion. Or they never saw any particular religious group as having anything relevant to say to them. And, as they point out, the Pacific Northwest, in particular, is a vast area of nuns, where a large part of the population, if you ask them, what's your religious affiliation, they'll say, well, I don't have any. What would you be if you had to pick something? Well, I don't know. Never really thought about that. There's other areas that kind of fit into that as well. And your book talks about some sort of, let's call it, recent ancient history that probably isn't particularly relevant about, the death of God movement in the 1960s, and Harvey Cox, the secular city. All of that is kind of, in some respects, beside the point. That was providing sort of an intellectual justification for being a nun. After a generation or so of nunnism, if you want to call it that, of really no substantive engagement with religion, people, are kind of at sea with what would it even mean to be religious? I remember meeting I grew up in the Midwest, and most people were affiliated with some sort of religious group when I was a kid, and probably they didn't practice too much of it. A lot of them were hypocrites, and those of us who had to go to catechism or stuff like that didn't learn an awful lot. But at least there was this sense of you were this or you were that, right? And it mattered in some sort of strange way. I remember meeting a graduate student from California, and he was one of the first people I'd met who genuinely didn't, he was sort of like a blank stare whenever we talk about religious issues. This was down in the Bible Belt, where I was going to graduate school in southern Illinois, which is really southern. And he just couldn't get it. Well, he was one of these sort of generational nuns. And it was striking to me to run into somebody like that. But that's a larger and larger part of our American population. Your book also talks about something else that's very interesting. I'm skipping over a bit of stuff here. And I'm actually going to put down the term that they coined for this. Sheilaism. So this guy, Robert Bellow, he had some co-writers on this book, The Habits of the Heart. He was a sociologist. He's the guy who came up with this big emphasis on civil religion that we're going to look at in the next chapter too. He found this woman, Sheila, and she was sort of emblematic of an attitude towards religion that's highly individualistic, very eclectic, we might say. Do you guys know what this term eclectic means? Yeah.
Isn't it like a lot of different things together?
Yeah, where it usually comes up, what kind of music do you like? I have eclectic tastes, right? I like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this. Think of it like, eclecticism, going to the buffet, as opposed to ordering off the menu, right? You get to pick whatever you like, and if you don't like this thing, don't pick that dish. Pick another dish. Fill up your plate or don't fill up your plate. So, I wish I had the quote here from her because it's really quite interesting. Here's how the book summarizes it. There was this woman, and she described, her name was Sheila, she described her religious position as Sheilaism. By this she meant that she had no need for traditional organized religious groups. Rather, she was content to fashion her own eclectic individualistic system of beliefs for herself. She'd like pick a little bit of this and a little bit of this, whatever was relevant for her at the time. In short, Sheilaism is a vividly specific example of religion in the modern world not disappearing, but becoming totally detached from any sort of communal, tradition-based, really any sort of community of belief and practice. And there's more and more people that are like that. A lot of people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, they probably would fit into this phenomenological description of Sheilaism. So here, the chapter ends with this paradox. American society is at the same time more religious in certain ways, because people who are religious are a bit more outspoken, they stand out more, and on the other hand, it's also a nation that's become much less religious at the same time. And it varies from place to place, Where are you going to find religion stronger? In the more traditional areas. Where are you going to find it weaker? In the places that are less traditional, where there's a lot of social change going on